Modality and mood. They sound kind of technical, right? Like
Yeah.
something you'd only hear in a linguistics lecture.
Yeah, maybe not something you'd chat about over coffee.
Exactly. But believe it or not, these concepts are working behind the scenes every time we open our mouths to speak or, tap out a text. You guys sink in some excerpts from the Oxford Handbook of Modality and Mood-dense stuff.
It's a real treasure trove of insights, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
But, like I said, dense. And that's where we come in. We're going to take you on a deep dive into how we use language to express ourselves, all the subtle nuances we can pack into our words, and why any of it even matters.
And what really gets me fired up about modality and mood is how they get to the core of how we use language to make sense of things, to navigate the world. And we're doing it all the time without even realizing it.
Totally. So to kick things off, could you give us a quick, jargon-free rundown of what these terms actually mean?
Sure thing. Let's start with mood. And it's actually pretty intuitive if you think about what mood means in our everyday lives, right? So in linguistics, mood refers to how we express ourselves. Are we making a statement? Are we asking a question? Or are we giving a command?
Ooh, I see.
These are all grammatical moods, and they really shape the fundamental purpose of our sentences.
Okay, so mood is kind of like the overall vibe or force of what we're saying.
Yeah.
So what about modality then? How does that fit in?
Modality, that's where we get into those shades of meaning, those fascinating ideas of possibility, necessity, obligation, and probability. Like, are we saying something might happen or that it must happen? All those little words, can, must, should, might, may, those are modal words, and they add those extra layers.
So if mood is the what we're saying, modality is the how.
In a way, yeah, it sort of adds in the speaker's own perspective, their own judgment about what they're saying.
I like it. Now, the editors of this handbook we've been mentioning, they actually talk about this kind of tricky dance between meaning and form. Like they give this example of a wink, right? And how a simple wink can mean completely different things depending on, the context and who's doing the winking.
Exactly. And that's the thing with modality and mood. Languages use all sorts of tools to express these things. Verbs, suffixes, particles, even just the way our voices go up and down when we speak.
It's true.
And those tools, they can be totally different from one language to the next. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. It's not like you can just look up mood or modality in a dictionary and call it a day. The meaning can be baked right into the grammar itself. Which reminds me of that example from the book Southern Ega and its two future tenses.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Southern Ega is a great example. This language, they've got these two ways of talking about the future, and they each carry different weights of certainty,
Yeah.
Like one way of saying it implies, yep, this is definitely going down, and the other one's more like, well, this could happen.
It's true. Yeah.
But what's really wild is that Southern Ega builds that distinction right into its verb tenses. It's like built into the very fabric of how they talk about time.
It's wild.
It really makes you think differently about how languages can actually infuse these really subtle shades of meaning into their grammar.
It shows how even something as basic as time, something we all think we understand, can be shaped by a language's rules and, a speaker's perspective. And speaking of how meaning can be nuanced, I have to bring up that example of not necessary versus necessary not. They seem almost interchangeable on the surface, but the book really digs into how they can mean really different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that example goes right to the heart of subjectivity and modality, especially this thing called epistemic modality. So it's not just about whether something is objectively true or false, it's about the speaker's take on it, like their own judgment of how likely or certain it is.
So we're always adding our own spin, our own understanding of the world, without even realizing it.
Exactly.
That's wild.
And that subjectivity, it's key to how we use language well. It's not just about spitting out facts. It's about expressing our perspective, our attitude.
Yeah.
It's like we're constantly reading between the lines, trying to decode what the other person really means.
It's true. It's like we're always adding these little layers to our words, right?
Yeah.
Like not just what we say, but how we say it.
Exactly. And, that reminds me of something else the book talks about, how different languages have wildly different ways of expressing modality and mood.
Oh, yeah. Like that example they give about Hicks Carrion.
Hicks Carrion, yeah. It's spoken in Brazil, and it has this thing called the debitive mood, which is super interesting.
Yeah, I remember that.
So imagine a grammatical mood that kind of blurs the lines between, an obligation and a straight-up command.
Yeah, it's kind of like one form can do double duty. It could be like, you got to do this or just do this. depending on how it's used, right?
Exactly. It really shows how different linguistic systems can be, how they each carve up these concepts in their own unique ways.
It's true. It's like a completely different way of thinking about grammar. And speaking of different ways of expressing things, there was that concept of zero coding that I thought was super interesting.
Oh, yeah. Zero coding.
It sounds kind of like a contradiction, doesn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
how can you express something grammatically without actually, well, using any grammar?
Right. It seems counterintuitive, but they gave that example of Hidatsa, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a Siouan language, and in Hidatsa, you can get this idea of certainty across, like make it crystal clear, but you don't actually need a specific word for it.
So it's like when you can just tell that someone's absolutely positive about something, even if they don't come right out and say, I'm certain.
Right. You can just tell. Like, think about how much we can communicate without even using words, right? Facial expressions, gestures,
Oh, totally.
even just like a well-placed pause. It's all a kind of zero coding, isn't it?
It's true. It's like we're always sending these subtle signals, whether we realize it or not, which kind of makes you think, is language even really about words at all? Or is it more about, I don't know, the whole package, the whole system of how we communicate?
That's a great question. And, it's something that linguists are constantly grappling with.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it? And it makes you realize how much more there is to language than meets the eye. Okay, so we've been talking about all these different ways that modality and mood are expressed. But the book also talks about how they change over time, right? This whole idea of grammaticalization.
Right, grammaticalization.
It's like
yeah.
these words, they start out as one thing, but then they kind of morph and take on these new grammatical roles.
Exactly.
Like they gave that example, I think it was threaten.
Yeah, threaten. So,
Right.
Originally it meant something like to pose a danger. Pretty straightforward.
Right, right. Like something's going to cause harm.
Exactly. But over time, it can also start to take on this more abstract meaning, like highly likely, like it threatens to rain.
So instead of a physical threat, it's more like a possibility.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly. That's so cool. And that shift, it illustrates how even the most basic elements of language words can change and adapt over time. It's like language itself is evolving.
That's amazing. It's like watching evolution in action, but for language.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how those changes often reflect deeper shifts in how we think and communicate. Like in the case of threaten, that shift towards expressing probability and likelihood, it kind of ties back into our earlier conversation about subjectivity, Like as words become grammaticalized, they often become less about objective reality and more about the speaker's assessment of the situation.
It's true. It's like we're always adding our own 2 cents, even when we don't realize it.
Exactly. And that's what makes language so dynamic and nuanced.
Okay, so we've got these words changing meaning over time. But the book also mentioned that there's like this debate about what actually drives those changes, right?
Yeah, there's this ongoing debate in linguistics about whether grammaticalization is driven more by semantics, so like the meaning of words, or by syntax,
Syntax B.
the structure of sentences, how words are arranged, like word order and stuff.
Gotcha. Okay, so like which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Does the meaning change first and then the grammar has to play catch up? Or is it the other way around?
Exactly. It's a really tricky question. And, like with most things in linguistics, there's no easy answer. It's probably a bit of both, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like language is messy.
Exactly. Language is messy. It's this complex, interwoven system, and it's constantly evolving.
It's true. It's like all these moving parts. You try to pin down one thing,
Yeah.
and then something else shifts, and it all changes. It reminds me, actually, there's this part later on in the book where they talk about construction grammar. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah. Construction grammar. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. So, like, how does that play into all of this? Because I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at language.
Yeah. So construction grammar basically says that meaning isn't just like prepackaged in individual words.
Okay.
It's actually created, it emerges from how those words are put together in these larger structures.
So it's not just the ingredients, it's the recipe.
Yes, exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's the recipe. Yeah. And this is super relevant to our discussion because construction grammar has a really interesting take on modality and mood.
Okay, I'm listening.
It suggests that, like, the specific job a modal verb does can actually change depending on the grammatical context, like the company it keeps within a sentence.
So it's the same modal verb could be doing different things in different sentences.
Exactly. It's not like it has this one fixed meaning that it always carries around. Its meaning is created in the moment, based on its relationships with all the other words in the sentence.
So it's all relative.
In a way, yeah. And this takes us right back to our chat about subjectivity, because with construction grammar, we can see how those subtle shades of meaning are coming from the structure of the whole sentence, not just from, like, one lonely word.
Right, right. It's like those optical illusions where you can look at the same shape, but depending on what's around it,
Yeah.
it seems to change.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. It's like our brains are wired to see those relationships, those connections, and that's how we understand the bigger picture.
It's amazing when you think about it, right? Like we're doing all this complex linguistic analysis without even realizing it. Our brains are just like wired for this stuff.
Totally. It really speaks to just how incredible language is. It's this amazing tool, and we just use it so effortlessly. But under the surface, there's all this stuff going on.
It's true. Well, wow, this has been quite the deep dive, I would say. We've really gone like deep, deep down into modality and mood. But you know what? It's actually made me realize that these concepts, they're not just for like academics and ivory towers, right?
Not at all.
They're relevant to all of us. They're at play in all of our communication.
Yeah, every time you open your mouth to speak, you're engaging with these concepts, whether you realize it or not.
It's true. And I think this deep dive has given us all a new appreciation for just how subtle and intricate and honestly amazing language really is.
Absolutely.
So the next time you're, I don't know, writing an email or arguing with your partner or, whatever, just like take a second to appreciate the power of modality and mood.
It's there, lurking beneath the surface of every sentence.
It really is. It's like a whole secret language hiding in plain sight.
I love that. A secret language hiding in plain sight.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably wrap things up. But thank you guys, as always, for joining us for this deep dive. And keep those brains buzzing. Keep exploring those secret languages.
Absolutely. And keep those questions coming.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, happy chatting.